Okay, so before I begin my video proper, I'm going to show a list of 5 songs that I do listen to and enjoy, 3 of which have music videos attached to them. And basically, I do what you can consider a digital puppet show of sorts, in which case the character basically gives a visual representation of my interests. Now, with all that said, hello and welcome. I am Neko AV, and this is my virtual presentation and a response to The War on Beauty with host Julia Hudson. Julia Davis. I'm sorry, I keep messing up. Anyways, in order to better understand her channel and what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to first reference how the stripping of beauty led us back to a primitive state. Now, I will admit, the first half of the video, I don't believe I fully understand. I think I still need to sit with it and think about it before I could better say anything. The second half of the video, though, is where it is important that I'm going to focus on. And with the second half of that video, basically talk about like how with philosophers they view humans as having like this primal side and then this logical side that are always contradicting each other, and how there is an excess valuing of the logical side, which has a negative effect on the human spirit. And then, of course, there is the stripping away, which may sound like a statement against minimalism, but I don't believe it is. After all, a cube is minimalistic. However, I think what Julia's talking about is how you take that cube, you keep removing its layers and its depth until eventually you just get a flat plane. You get a square. So instead of a cube, you have a square. And I do think that's what she's talking about. And that is something that I do see when it comes to modern culture, especially when it comes to the arts. And of course, music is an audio art form. So this, of course, being something that I've done in past videos, in which case I talk about stuff in relation to modern music. So, with that said, on to what actually got me motivated to want to do this. First up, the first video I'm going to talk about is Benson Boone, Paganini, and the problem with modern music. Now I'm going to focus more on when she's talking about Paganini, and an interesting thing she points out is about how with Paganini, taking chaos and sculpting beauty from chaos. And a lot of this is reminding me of another person by the name of Andy Edwards. And in many of his videos, he talks about the same thing, but instead of calling it beauty, he calls it the sublime. Though I do believe that both the beauty and the sublime are connected, at least what Julia seems to be defining beauty as. In which case you take the chaos, this chaos that exists in artists. Of course, the question comes, where does the chaos come from? Well, that goes back to the whole thing of the primal and the logical. And rather than valuing one over the other, or trying to find a balance between the two, instead, what these artists do who create something that's beautiful, something that's sublime, is they take that chaos, the two contradictions, and have it work in harmony with each other. And by having this harmony, we get the sublime and we get the beautiful, And like I said, it isn't just what Julia talks about, it's also what Andy Edwards has talked about. Though I do make a point of making mention of this video in particular by Andy Edwards, The Future of Music, because there are 2 major points that he gets into. 1, how important collaboration is, and 2, the value of community. And an interesting thing Andy talks about is about artists taking what they can do, working with other artists and what they do, to come together with their respective communities. They work together on a collaboration, and you create something and if you can get this, working together, sculpting this greater chaos into something sublime and beautiful, you, in a sense, create something that well, like I said, he creates something that is sublime, something that can be considered beautiful. Matter of fact, with the songs that I showed at the very beginning, a lot of that is from collaboration. And what we get is something that's interesting. And then you have like different communities who end up coming together, end up creating a larger community. And you get something that's very social and something that truly is the definition of sublime and beautiful. I wish I could had better words to say, but yeah, I think that's what I'm getting from Julia and her video. But of course, so there's the other part with Benson Boone, got people who are talking against Benson Boone and whatnot. And I think that relates heavily to that other video, what I'm going to get into. See, Julia interviewed her brother Hudson, talking about the decline of music and the death of the soul. And I'm not inclined to say it's a death of the soul, but more like an encapsulation of the soul. Taking that cube that represents depth and whatnot, many layers, and instead using that to create a cage. And so people put their soul into that cage, and to prevent people from seeing anything, instead they have just the one side that you don't see the soul through. The one side you can't see through into the soul. What people see is a square instead of a cube, and the soul that gets boxed in. But to better understand this, I'm going to focus on one thing in particular and expand outwards of what Hudson brought up, which is how school can have a negative effect. Not just being taught something that shouldn't be taught, but there's a bit more than that. And I'm going to reference these 4 people in order to better talk about what I mean. And I'm going to work from the bottom up, seeing how I keep talking in circles whenever I try to put in the original order. Starting off with Tantacruel and his video, Corporate Music and How to Compose with No Soul. Now, while his video does start with a minute-long parody, after that he gets right into the meat and potatoes. But I think in order to get to what I'm talking about, I would have to talk about his interpretation of a book called Dialect Enlightenment by Horkheimer and Adorno, 2 names that I keep mispronouncing as well, getting mixed up on. But yeah, with Dialect of Enlightenment, there's a section that talks about the introversion of sacrifice. And I will admit, if I had read the book myself, that part would have went way over my head. But Tantacruel ends up saying something interesting about that, which relates to what I say about encapsulating the soul, in which case people will hold back anything that's emotional and expressive in favor of just the one side that's the most pleasable, the plain side, the square. People keep to it and just stay with like something that's very basic. Going upwards to the late Sir Ken Robinson, who passed away a few years ago. Would have been great to have his input on this. But yeah, what Ken Robinson had talked about in his presentation, Do Schools Kill Creativity? He talks about how schools teach like there's only one right answer. The worst thing is to be wrong. We're taught that. And so if something that doesn't look like the right answer, then it looks like the wrong answer, even though it could very well just be something different. And a large part about what Ken Robinson spoke of in his presentations is about how something may not be wrong, but it could just be different, Intelligence isn't this one thing. It's multifaceted. But of course, people aren't taught that, which goes up to Aiden Paladin and her video, The Educationism Epidemic. And while her video is focused more on how the negative effects of education affects politics, I do believe that what she talks about also goes to explain how this affects society. Now, why do people keep their soul caged in? Why do they encapsulate the soul Well, because with a lot of schooling, it ends up teaching us to value the mechanical over the emotional. And so what end up we're being taught is not just that you can't be wrong, there's only one right answer, but that you also need to have a more mechanical approach, much like what Hudson talked about when interviewed by Julia, which is that people have a very mechanical approach. And it isn't just the people approaching the arts and everything else mechanically. There's also the fact that people will also value the mechanical, so much so that some people may even view the mechanical as more human rather than everything that's underneath, which is also why people will leave their emotions and expression all caged up, in which case you don't see someone's soul, you just see output and that's it. Nothing else that says anything of the self. Nothing, no depth, no expression or anything like that. And this relates finally to Ted Gioia and his video, The Secret Shame of Music. Now an interesting thing about Ted Gioia is that, to quickly summarize it, he talks about how it isn't just the whole thing with education. You have your philosophical leaders and your religious leaders talking about what is considered good music and bad music. And unfortunately, what ends up being classified as bad music is something that is expressive, something that's emotional, which ties into everything else. To fit in, people keep their soul closed in, they don't express. And so you have artists who not only refuse to show what is in their soul, what they express, what they are interested in, but you also have it where people don't value it as well, which is why oftentimes when someone's being genuine or sincere, some people will be quick to say that they are cringe. And so that's what we have when it comes to modern music. But of course, though, that isn't the only thing, because there's also another element of perspective that is affected as well. And I'm going to end by talking about these two songs, Man-Child and Yes I Am. Now, Man-Child, I can understand people dismissing it as your typical slop that's in pop culture, because the first couple of minutes it is just like that. It sounds cynical, going, this person that wants to talk to me, that's a man-child. But the last minute of that song says, despite the man-child, despite the fact that I find the man-child annoying, I find that man-child to be endearing. With lines like, I like my men incompetent. And so that's what we have with Man-Child, which is why I'm inclined to say that as far as modern music goes, that's something that I do have a bit of a soft spot of, even though I would favor the five that I mentioned at the very start of the video, especially Maury Calliope's Orpheus, or even those that I haven't mentioned, such as the song Music Box of Fate, which is another collaborative effort amongst various people. But yeah, with Sabrina Carpenter and Man-Child, I am reminded of Yes I Am, which does come off as another breakup song. The first verse does have that whole cynical element to it, but as the song goes on, you find that the character is also saying, yeah, I messed up too, and our relationship's messed up, but we will tell people that everything is fine. Which is a refreshing fresh breath, which, like I said, it's a breath of refreshing air. Wow, I keep tumbling amongst my words. But this is another side of modern music. You have stuff that blends in so much with pop culture that it sounds like slop, such as with Man-Child, and then you get stuff that can be easily ignored unless you're within a certain community, such as with the song Yes I Am. And unfortunately, this slop does tend to get the most attention. But that is the state of modern music. And my tracking is getting weird for some reason. I just noticed that now, so an apology there. But yeah. So that's what I had to say when it comes to it. And what I view is the state of modern music and as a response to the war on beauty. So with all that said, I am Neko AB, and I thank you for watching.